Good evening, Dungeon Masters. I'm Baron Derop. Engaging with the various factions of your D&D campaign setting is a great way to add political intrigue to your games. But as a Dungeon Master, it can be difficult without some kind of management system to think through how those various factions would interact with each other and leverage those interactions for rumors and quest hooks. However, by systematically thinking through the limits of each faction's resources and abilities, you can breathe tons of life into your campaign setting while spending minimal time on prep between sessions. While factions might have a number of goals, those goals are constrained by a number of limitations. These limitations might include the faction's political environment, access to commodities and resources, and the ideology of the people who make up the organization as a whole. All of these limitations inform what makes that faction insecure. Additionally, failure to manage these limitations effectively, or even allowing competing interests to exploit these limitations, can cause the faction to falter or even disintegrate. As an example, let's build two different factions together. The Blood Crows, a dark assassins guild servicing clients in the top echelon of society, and the Cardinal Trading Confederation, a regional hegemon of allied city-states who enjoy a complex trade network. It goes without saying, then, that the strategic imperatives of the Assassins Guild will obviously be different from the trade confederations. The guild will be concerned with limiting the number of people who know how to contact the guild directly, minimizing the number of people who can expose the guild from within, and ensuring the local law enforcement doesn't become wise of their operations. Meanwhile, the Trade Confederation will be concerned with managing ill-protected trade routes through frontier territory, maintaining the flow of important commodities from foreign nations, and balancing the conflicting concerns of each individual city-state. Notice that these strategic imperatives are not solutions. They're statements about the major concerns each faction faces. Obviously, a faction might have a myriad of problems that must be managed on a day-to-day basis, but these imperatives should succinctly describe generalized, ongoing, and high-level issues. General trade route security is a better understanding of an issue than detailing the conflicts with any particular band of highwaymen or goblin raiding party, for example. Since these statements are general in nature, a typical faction will usually have 2 to 5 strategic imperatives. Usually 3 is the sweet spot. Once we know what imperatives keeps the faction leadership up at night, we can think through what tools it has at its disposal for resolving those ongoing problems. If all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, or so the old saying goes. But very few factions have only hammers in their arsenal. Knowing what tools are available and what relationships and reputations they enjoy go a long way in maintaining a faction's strategic imperatives. Assets like these can be described in just a few words, and have enough punch to swing problematic situations in their favor when employed to the fullest extent. For example, the Blood Crows might have assets including a team of surgical hitmen, a spy in their city's court, and a secretive operational doctrine. Meanwhile, the Cardinal Trading Confederation might have well-paid mercenaries, powerful legal connections, and a highly bureaucratic tax code. Similar to our understanding of a faction's strategic imperatives, these assets, regardless if they describe important political connections or a portfolio of magic items, should be stated in just a few words. The purpose of this exercise is to generalize the most potent assets a faction has access to, not list a detailed census of inventoried equipment. Once we know what assets each faction has, we can reflect on their strategic imperatives and develop goals to resolve and mitigate them. A grand strategy is a series of goals the faction will attempt to carry out in order to mitigate its weaknesses and further its ideological agenda. Working on these goals will ideally utilize the assets the faction has at their disposal. For example, the Blood Crows, in an effort to preserve their secrecy, might have the goals eliminating a junior assassin who has fallen from leadership's favor, as well as relocating their base to a more secretive location. Meanwhile, the Cardinal Trading Confederacy might wish to to construct fortifications along the frontier trade routes, and leverage their legal connections to stymie local responses of federal overreach. These example strategic goals might seem obvious for these particular factions, but not all factions will or should have such typically thematic assets to resolve their problems. If we were to reverse these assigned assets, these two factions would have radically different grand strategies to resolve their imperatives. How would a trade confederation solve its problems if it only had a team of surgical hitmen and a secretive doctrine? Instead of building forts and patrolling roads with mercenaries, the Trade Confederation might secretly eliminate the leadership of nearby city-states who refuse to more heavily patrol frontier roads on the Confederation's behalf. Therefore, don't be scared to grant a few factions some oddball or lopsided assets for some surprising and interesting storytelling. Once a faction's strategic imperatives, assets, and goals are listed, we can use their interactions to generate rumors and quest hooks. For your campaign setting, identify some 5 or so important factions who operate in your game world. In a typical Fantasyland setting, a king and his court, a trade or merchant guild, a religious or arcane order, and some kind of criminal gang are all good templates to start with. Next, for each faction's goals, decide each goal's difficulty, easy, moderate, or hard. At the beginning of your campaign and in between sessions, for each faction, choose a goal that each faction plans to work toward, and roll a d20 to test progress toward that goal. On an 11 or higher, the faction makes meaningful progress. If the faction is clearly utilizing a particular asset at their disposal, make the roll with advantage. However, if the faction's goal is in friction or conflict with another faction's activity, make the roll at disadvantage instead. For each success, the faction works incrementally toward that given goal. Easy goals might need only 3 successes to complete, moderate goals need 4 or 5, and difficult ones might need as many as 8 successes. If you make these checks roughly once per week in game time, an easy goal might take as many as 3 weeks to complete, while much more complicated or time-consuming goals, especially goals that conflict with other factions, might require a number of months. As an example, our Trade Confederation might make good progress toward constructing a fort in frontier regions, like clearing and grading land. However, the Assassin's Guild might eliminate a key engineer, foreman, or manager working on the project, since the fort is being built near the same location the assassins intended to build their new secret base. Further, as these factions interact with each other, don't be scared to slowly adjust their assets, strategic imperatives, or grand strategy as the campaign develops. Factions may lose or gain assets, and the methods they would use to solve their problems would reflect those changes. The Trade Confederation's mercenary company, for example, once housed in the completed fortress, might no longer be a useful asset if an orc warband routs them in battle. After a faction completes work on a particular goal, it might be wise to grant them a new asset reflective of that goal's outcome, like granting the Trade Confederation an asset labeled Fortifications Dotting the Frontier. With all that said, if your party is working on a quest that explicitly favors a particular faction's goal, you shouldn't roll for the outcome. The party's actions will always determine if the goal fails or succeeds. Additionally, this is a great way to identify when a party has truly upset a powerful faction and how to measure that faction's response. While players might be thrown in jail for drunken, disorderly conduct, how would the Assassin's Guild react if the party unknowingly eliminated their spy in the local city court? Also, there's nothing wrong with explicitly pinning a particular faction's goals, perhaps your main antagonist's goals, to a clear timeline. This can help you understand how the other factions in the game world would react to this particular faction's presence and activity, even if its own actions are on a fixed schedule. Lastly, if you have friends who wish they could play D&D with you but can't commit to a weekly game session, asking them to partake in faction design and management can be a fun minigame to play between your normal D&D sessions. Regardless of each faction's activity, use how those actions interact with each other to develop a brief narrative or journal of the events transpiring around the campaign setting. This journal will be a goldmine for quest hooks, rumors, or otherwise just giving your NPCs in the tavern something to talk about. If you'd like to download a worksheet that details the process I've outlined in this video, please check out the link in the description below. If you'd like to help me make more content like this in the future, please consider supporting me on Patreon or becoming a channel member. Thanks for watching, Dungeon Masters, and until next time, good night.